Welcome back to Lifespan Development. We're in chapter 6. In this chapter, we'll be talking about the first 2 years of life, the cognitive developmental changes that will be occurring. So let's get started. All right, so there are some basic learning processes that we need to talk about before we can really get into sort of the cognitions of babies. The first one is habituation. This is a term that refers to a reaction that a learner has once they have gathered all the information that they can gain out of a stimulus. So those were some pretty formal learning terms: learner, stimulus. Habituation has been observed in animals, in humans, in babies, baby humans, baby animals. So habituation is a very basic learning process. The great news is that once the behaviorists had discovered that habituation occurs, that the learner will lose interest in the stimulus once they've gathered all the information from it that they can, developmentalists were able to apply that to babies and start figuring out what kinds of things babies know, what babies find interesting, what things babies remember. So just to give you a couple of examples of habituation studies, we talked in a previous chapter about babies recognizing their mom's voices. One of the ways that we know that for sure is through habituation studies. They'll put a set of headphones on a little baby, newborn baby, and it plays mom's voice. And in that context, the baby will close its eyes, it'll suck on the pacifier that it's in its mouth, and cuddle in, all calm and relaxed as it's experiencing this very familiar stimulus, its mom. And then a stranger's voice will break in, and the baby's eyes will fly open. It'll stop sucking on the pacifier, and then it comes back to mom, and the baby settles back down, starts sucking again. So you can tell from that reaction that it knows its mom's voice and it doesn't know this other voice that has popped in, because suddenly it wants to gather more information from the new voice. So we see that in all sorts of different areas of cognition as measures of what babies know. So for example, they can test 3-month-olds to see whether they expect the same number of dolls to be on the stage when the screen is lifted as there were before the screen was dropped. And of course, unbeknownst to the baby, somebody behind the scenes can pull out dolls or add more dolls to it, and so it looks like it's happening by magic, right, to the baby, because they don't know that anybody has touched anything. And so if by 3 months of age, if the correct number of dolls is there, the baby will habituate and will lose interest and will look away. But if the wrong number of dolls is there, the baby will stare really hard, like, what happened? They also have been able to show that babies by the age of 6 months understand gravity. So they'll put an object on a table and then push it off the table. And if it doesn't fall, the babies will stare really hard at that. Whereas if it falls, then they look away. They've habituated. So it shows that they expect it to fall. If it doesn't fall, then they're really surprised. And again, it's trickery behind the backdrop. So, obviously the researchers can't violate the rules of gravity, but they can make a baby think that they have done that. So there's been a lot of different studies of babies and their memories and their understanding of physics and other kinds of things and counting and other things that have been established through habituation studies. So thankfully, the behaviorists figured out habituation, and that became a really great tool for developmentalists. Another basic learning process that's really relevant for developmental research is conditioning, particularly classical conditioning. If you remember back to the chapter on theories where they talked about Pavlovian conditioning, where in the examples that Pavlov started with, a bell rings and the dog learns that it predicts food, and so the dog drools. Well, with a baby, we're not necessarily going to be ringing bells and seeing if they drool, but we are going to look to see whether they put together two events out in the world, whether one thing predicts another. So one of the things that they put together is that their behavior can have an effect on the environment. We call this contingency awareness. And, we talked in a previous lecture about how newborn babies cry reflexively. They don't cry to manipulate. They don't cry on purpose. They cry because they're in a state, hunger, cold, pain, that makes them have to cry. It's a reflex. As babies move out of the newborn phase, they start to realize that when I cry, my needs get met. And so that makes it more likely that when they have a need, they will cry. And expect that the environment will tend to their need. That process is called contingency awareness. They become aware that they have some amount of control over the environment. Through their own behavior, they can elicit what they need out of the environment. So I've heard parents say that you should let babies cry things out sometimes and not always respond to all their cries because they'll start to manipulate you. Well, I don't know if manipulation and a baby who's less than 6 months goes together, but what I worry about is that a parent who decides to randomly decide when to tend to their baby's needs and when not to tend to their baby's needs can develop what's called learned helplessness in the baby. This is a type of conditioning that was discovered in the 1940s through some research that sounds very mean to dogs. We wouldn't want to do this to a dog today, that's for sure. They put them into a wire cage, and there was a barrier in the middle of the cage that was low enough that the dog could hop over it. So it was just sort of more of a visual barrier. And they would electrify the bottom of the cage where the dog was. And for half of the dogs, if they jumped over the barrier, the other side of the cage wasn't electrified, so they could escape the shock. For the other half of the dogs, if they jumped over the barrier, that side was also electrified and they would continue to get shocked. It didn't take long for the dogs to realize in the second condition that there was no point in jumping over the barrier. The bad part about that story isn't just that the dogs were getting shocked, but that after learning that it doesn't matter whether they jump the barrier or not, even after the researchers made it so that if you would jump the barrier, you'll find out you're not going to get shocked over here, they wouldn't jump the barrier. They gave up. They learned to be helpless. And we don't want to teach our babies to be helpless by being random in our responses to their cries and things like that. It's not a good message to send to a baby that no matter what you do, no one cares and nobody's going to come and help you. So contingency awareness is a goal. It's not manipulation. It's a goal for babies to realize that they have a mechanism for conveying their needs and getting their needs met. Imitation is another basic learning process. There's a whole field of learning theory called observational learning, or some people call it social learning. Observational learning is that process that we all go through all the time. Us adults do it all the time. We go into a new situation where we're not very sure about exactly how to behave, and we look around and we see what is everybody else doing, and we adopt those behaviors. So we'll fit in, right? It's very uncommon for a person to go into a new environment and then just act differently than everybody else. I mean, that's very uncommon. It might actually be a symptom, right, of something being wrong. Most of us go in and we observe what's going on and we learn from that and we adopt those behaviors. So observational learning is something that we will display lifelong. Within that, though, we have things that we see that are usually very much confined to different developmental stages. In the first year of life, we see babies doing a lot of what we call immediate imitation. So I have a little video queued up for you in the playlist that will show you a series of babies immediately imitating, and I narrate over it. So I'll let you watch that next in the playlist, and I'll see you on the other side.